She was scared of the Mafia boss, until he saw her scars, then everything changed. The wedding night she'd been dreading ended with 2 words that broke him. "Thank you. Thank you for not touching me," she whispered, trembling in a robe he'd handed her instead of tearing off. Nora Blake was 24, married to a man twice her age, whose name made prosecutors go silent and CEOs nervous. She'd spent the entire day waiting for the inevitable, for Carver Ross to claim what her uncle had sold him. But when he saw the scars covering her back like a roadmap of hell, everything changed. He didn't ask who did it, he already knew. And by morning, the man who'd spent 40 years building an empire on fear decided to use that power for something he'd never done before: protection without possession. Subscribe right now, because what happens next will shatter every assumption you have about power, fear, and what it means to be seen. The wedding ceremony had been small, cold, transactional. 20 people in a courthouse downtown, all of them from Carver's side, except for Griffin Blake, who stood beside his niece with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and a hand that gripped her elbow just a fraction too tight. Nora wore a white dress someone else had chosen, stood beside a man she'd met exactly once, and spoke vows that tasted like ash in her mouth. Carver Ross barely looked at her during the ceremony. His face was carved stone grey eyes that missed nothing, sharp jaw, silver threading through dark hair, swept back from a forehead that had never learned to soften. He was 48 years old, and built like violence, held perfectly still, like a storm that had decided to wear an expensive suit instead of destroying everything in its path. When the judge pronounced them married, Carver didn't kiss her, just nodded once, turned, and walked out. She followed, because there was nowhere else to go. The estate sat outside Seattle, tucked behind gates and walls, and the kind of security that made statements without saying a word. Inside, everything was pristine. Marble floors, high ceilings, furniture that looked like it had never been used. A house that felt more like a museum than a place where people actually lived. That night, Nora stood in the master bedroom, waiting for what she believed was inevitable. The room had been prepared by hands that weren't hers. Wine on the bureau, dim amber lights, king bed with white sheets pulled back like an invitation she hadn't extended. She wore the white dress still, because no one had told her to change, and she was afraid to make decisions without permission. Her hands were clasped at her stomach, fingers laced so tight, her knuckles had gone pale. She was breathing in careful counts. Inhale 4, hold 2, exhale 4. The rhythm she'd practiced so many times, it had become reflex. The breathing of someone who'd spent years teaching herself to be invisible. The door opened. Carver walked in, still in his wedding suit, minus the jacket. He didn't look at her, just moved to the window, stood with his back to the room, hands in his pockets. "There's a robe in the closet," he said, voice low and unhurried. "Take the bed. I'll sleep in the study." Nora didn't move, couldn't process the words. This had to be a test, or a game, or cruelty disguised as kindness before the real cruelty began. Her uncle had been explicit about the arrangement. She was payment for a debt, and payment had terms. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You don't need to." Carver turned then, grey eyes landing on her for the first time since they'd left the courthouse. "The bed is yours. I won't touch you. Get some sleep." He moved toward the door. That's when it happened. Exhaustion, trembling hands, the weight of a day spent barely breathing. Her dress strap slipped. Not intentional, just gravity and fear. The fabric shifted enough to reveal the edge of scar tissue across her shoulder, white against skin, raised and deliberate. Carver stopped, turned, saw it. Something changed in his face. Not shock, calculation. The look of a man solving an equation only he could see. Turn around. Not a request. A command. Nora's blood froze. This was it. The moment she'd been dreading since Griffin had told her about the arrangement 3 weeks ago. She turned slowly, heart hammering so hard she thought her ribs might crack. Carver crossed the room. His footsteps were measured, controlled. He reached for the zipper at the back of her dress. She braced for pain, for hands that took, for the inevitability of what men did to women they'd purchased. The zipper slid down. 1 inch, 2, 3. Carver went completely still. The scars began just below the nape of her neck, and ran in layered, overlapping ridges down the length of her back, and across both shoulders. Some were thin and pale, raised like cursive written in skin. Others were wider, darker belt marks that had healed badly. Burn marks in precise circles, patterns that spoke of years, not incidents. Methodical, repeated. Someone had done this over and over, and that someone had been practiced. Carver's hand remained on the zipper, fingers motionless, suspended against fabric. His breath came slow through his nose, controlled the way he always breathed. But something behind his ribs had shifted. Something heavy, something that had no name yet. He withdrew his hand, didn't touch her skin, stepped back, 1 step, 2, and set his hands at his sides, palms open, as though disarming himself of a weapon she couldn't see. "Who did this to you?" His voice was different now, stripped of the controlled authority he normally wore like armor. This was something underneath, something raw. Nora's shoulders drew inward. Small unconscious motion of someone who'd been seen in this position before and knew what came next. Disgust, questions, or the particular silence before being discarded. Please, she whispered, voice breaking. Please don't ask me that. It was the first thing she'd said to him all day. Her voice was small, fractured, built from borrowed air. The voice of someone who'd learned that answering certain questions led to certain consequences. Carver looked at her shaking back, at the roadmap of pain carved into her skin, at the way she stood there exposed and braced for impact. And something inside him that had been dormant so long he'd forgotten it existed, began to stir. Not desire, not pity. Rage. Cold, precise, architectural rage. The kind that doesn't burn, the kind that builds. He walked to the closet, removed a robe, dark grey, oversized, soft, crossed back to where she stood. He didn't touch her, just held the robe open behind her, the way one holds an umbrella for a stranger in rain. Offered, not imposed. Put this on. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see fabric in his hands. Confusion rippled across her face. Genuine, naked confusion that comes when reality contradicts every expectation a body has been conditioned to hold. She took the robe, pulled it over her shoulders, wrapped it around herself, held it closed at her chest with both hands like it was armor. Sit down, Carver said, gesturing to armchair by window. You're sleeping in the bed tonight. I'll take the chair in the study. She blinked. You're not sleeping with me tonight. He cut her off. The sentence carried no disappointment, no anger, no negotiation. Statement of fact, delivered with same certainty he used to close deals. You are sleeping, that's all. Take the bed. He moved toward the door. Mr. Ross. He stopped, turned, face unreadable in lamplight, that caught silver in his hair and hard lines of his jaw. For one moment, he looked like exactly what the world said he was. Dangerous, impenetrable, carved from something colder than stone. Thank you, she said, voice cracked on second word. For not. She couldn't finish the sentence. He understood what she meant. Thank you for not touching me. Thank you for not demanding what you paid for. Thank you for not adding your name to the list of men who've used my body as currency. Carver looked at his wife of 6 hours, and felt something settle in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. It sank slowly, displacing everything else, and by the time it reached bottom, he knew with absolute clarity that this night had changed something fundamental. Good night, he said. He closed the door behind him, and for the first time in 40 years, stood in a hallway of his own home, and didn't know what to do next. Inside the bedroom, Nora sat on the edge of the bed, with robe pulled tight, and stared at closed door like it was a riddle she'd never been taught to solve. No man had ever given her a robe. No man had ever looked at her scars and stepped back instead of forward. No man had ever said good night, and meant only that. She pulled knees to chest, pressed face into soft fabric that smelled like cedar, and something warmer. And for first time in as long as she could remember, Nora didn't cry herself to sleep because she was afraid. She cried because she was confused. Because kindness, when it arrives in a place where only cruelty has ever lived, is the most disorienting thing in the world. 3 days passed. Carver watched his wife the way he watched enemies from distance, without announcing his attention, cataloguing every detail. He watched her at breakfast, where she sat at the far end of the long dining table, and ate so carefully that each bite seemed calculated to produce the least possible sound. She buttered her toast in precise geometric strokes. She never poured her own coffee until he had poured his. She never sat down until he was already seated. She never started eating until he had taken his first bite. These weren't manners. These were survival instincts dressed in courtesy. He watched her in the hallways of the estate, where she moved along the walls like water following a channel, always taking the path that put the most distance between herself and any person she encountered. When one of his men passed her, she would stop, press herself slightly to the side, lower her eyes, and wait until they had gone. She didn't do this out of respect. She did it the way a small animal freezes when a shadow passes overhead. He watched her in the kitchen on the second morning at 6 a.m., 2 hours before anyone else was awake. She was scrubbing the countertop, not cleaning it, scrubbing it. Her hands were red. The sponge was soaked through. The counter was already spotless. But she continued working in tight, obsessive circles, her face blank, her eyes unfocused, as though she were somewhere else entirely. Carver stood in the doorway for 45 seconds before she noticed him. When she did, the sponge dropped from her hand. She spun around. Her back hit the counter. Her breath stopped. I'm sorry, she said immediately. Before he had spoken, before he had moved, the apology was automatic, fired from a reflex so deeply embedded, it preceded all thought. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I was just Nora. His voice stopped her. Not because it was loud, because it was calm, because it held her name like a fact, not a threat. You don't need to apologize for cleaning a kitchen. She stared at him. Her hands were shaking again. She pressed them behind her back against the counter, hoping he wouldn't see. He saw. I just wanted to make sure everything was. She stopped. The truth of what she'd been doing, not cleaning but coping, hung between them like something fragile and exposed. Carver crossed to the coffee maker. He prepared 2 cups. He set one on the counter beside her, leaving enough space between his hand and hers that there was no risk of contact. Then he took his cup and sat at the kitchen island, 3 full stools away from where she stood. Sit, he said. Then, after a pause that cost him more than he expected, if you'd like. The addition surprised him. He did not typically qualify his statements. He did not give options. But something about the geometry of this woman, the way she occupied space, as though trying to compress herself into the smallest possible shape, made his usual cadence feel wrong. Heavy, blunt. She picked up the coffee. She sat. Not beside him, 2 stools away, but she sat. They drank in silence. It was the longest Carver had been in a room with another person without speaking, negotiating or issuing instructions in over 20 years. And it was the first time he noticed that silence could have texture, that it could be thick with things unsaid, or thin and cautious, or as it was in this moment, something resembling the very first thread of something that might, with extraordinary patience, become trust. On the 4th day, Carver called Owen Cross into his study. Owen was his chief of security, 56 years old, built like a vault, with a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts. He'd been with Carver for 18 years. He was the only man in the organization who could look Carver in the eyes without flinching. "I need a background file," Carver said. He was standing at the window, hands clasped behind his back. "On the Blake family, complete. Every address, every hospital visit, every school record, every police report, sealed and unsealed. I want it by tonight." Owen studied his boss for a long moment. "Your wife's family." "Yes, something happened." Carver turned from the window. His face was composed as always, but there was something in the stillness of it that Owen had only seen 3 or 4 times in 2 decades. Something compressed, something held back by discipline alone. "Just get me the file." Owen nodded. He did not ask again. The file arrived at 9 p.m. Carver read it alone in his study, behind a locked door, with a glass of scotch he did not drink. The documents told a story that was not told in words. It was told in patterns, in gaps, in the specific language of institutional failure. Nora Blake had been admitted to the emergency room 7 times between the ages of 11 and 19. The first visit listed the cause as a fall from a bicycle. The second, a staircase. The third, another fall. By the 4th visit, the attending physician had noted in a margin, handwritten, small, a detail that should have saved a child, and didn't, that the injuries were inconsistent with the stated cause. No investigation was opened. No follow-up was recorded. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 9. After that, her uncle Griffin Blake had taken custody. Raised her alone. Raised was a generous word. The school records showed chronic absences. The medical records showed escalating injuries. The police records showed nothing, because no one had ever called. Griffin Blake was a mid-level operator in the smuggling network, a man who moved product through rural corridors and had for years provided logistics to Carver's organization without distinction. A useful man, an unremarkable man, the kind of man who smiled at the right people and went home to house where doors were locked from the inside. Carver closed the file. He sat in the darkness of his study and felt the rage he had carried since the wedding night solidify into something harder, something with edges, something that would, when the time came, cut with surgical precision. He thought about the scars on her back. He thought about the careful, practiced breathing, the flinching, the obsessive cleaning, the immediate apologies. Every behavior decoded, recontextualized, stripped of ambiguity. She had been broken systematically by someone who had been given the one authority that should never be weaponized, the authority of a guardian. Carver poured his scotch down the sink. He sat in the dark for a long time. And when he finally moved, it was not with the cold efficiency of a man conducting business. It was with the slow, deliberate weight of a man who had just decided something that could not be undone. The next morning, Nora found a small stack of books on the table beside the bed she now slept in alone. There was no note, no explanation, just 5 books carefully chosen, spines uncracked. 2 novels, a collection of poetry, a travel memoir about walking through Tuscany, and a cookbook, not instructional, but the kind that was more memoir than recipe. The kind that told stories through food. She touched their spines. She did not pick them up. She did not know what they meant. She did not know if they were a gift or a test. In her experience, things given freely were debts in disguise. But she looked at them for a long time. And later that afternoon, when the house was quiet, she took the cookbook to the garden bench and opened it in the sun. For 20 minutes she read about a woman in Provence who made lavender honey while mourning her husband. And Nora did not realize she was smiling until the wind moved her hair across her face and broke the spell. She closed the book quickly. She looked around as though someone might have seen. No one had, except Carver, who was watching from the window of his study, his face expressionless, his chest tight with something he did not yet have the vocabulary to name. 2 weeks into the marriage, Griffin Blake called. Carver took the call in his study. He listened for 3 minutes. His face did not change. When the call ended, he set the phone down and remained still for a long time. Griffin wanted to visit. He wanted to see his niece. He framed it as paternal concern. He used phrases like, making sure she's settled, and just checking in on her. His voice was warm, reasonable, practiced. The voice of a man who had spent a lifetime constructing a version of himself that other people found acceptable. Carver agreed to the visit, not because he wanted to, because he needed to see it. He needed to see what Griffin Blake looked like standing in the same room as the woman whose back he had turned into a canvas of suffering. He needed to watch, he needed to measure, and then he needed to decide. That night, for the first time, Nora knocked on his study door at 8 p.m. and asked if he wanted tea. He did not want tea. He had never in 48 years of living expressed a preference for tea. But he said yes. She made it in the kitchen. He heard the kettle, the clink of cups, the soft sound of her feet on tile. When she returned, she set the cup on his desk, close enough to reach, far enough to not require proximity, and sat in the leather chair across from him. She did not speak. She held her own cup in both hands, her legs tucked beneath her, and she read the cookbook again. She had moved on to a chapter about a grandmother in Oaxaca, who made mole for 40 people every Sunday, and the description of chocolate melting into chili paste made her lips move slightly, unconsciously, as though she were tasting the words. Carver pretended to work. He watched her read. He noticed that her shoulders were down. Her breathing was even. Her feet were bare, tucked beneath her, which meant she had removed her shoes somewhere between the kitchen and this room, which meant she had done something she had never done in this house before. She had made herself comfortable. The significance of bare feet, of relaxed shoulders, of a woman reading in a room with a man she had once been terrified to look at. These were small things. To anyone else, they would have been nothing. To Carver Ross, they were a language, and he was only beginning to learn it. Griffin Blake arrived on Saturday afternoon, in a grey suit that was slightly too large, and shoes that were slightly too polished. He was a compact man, 5'9", with thinning hair combed carefully across his scalp, and a smile that appeared on command, wide and empty, the kind of smile that existed to fill silence. Carver met him in the foyer. They shook hands. Griffin's grip was firm and eager, the grip of a man who wanted to be perceived as substantial. Carver, Griffin said, using the first name deliberately, an attempt to establish familiarity where none existed. Beautiful home, truly. I can see why you. She's in the garden, Carver said. The smile flickered, adjusted, held. Wonderful. She always did love being outside, even as a little girl. Couldn't keep her indoors. He laughed. The sound was hollow. Carver said nothing. He led Griffin through the house. They found Nora on the garden bench. She was reading the cookbook. She'd been reading it every afternoon for 3 days, sitting in the same spot, in the same position, and Carver had noticed that each day she sat a little more comfortably, a little less like someone waiting to be interrupted. She heard their footsteps on the stone path, and looked up. The book fell from her hands. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was not a choice. The book simply left her fingers, because every muscle in her body had locked simultaneously. Her face, which had been soft and open in the afternoon light, collapsed into something flat and rigid. Her eyes went wide, then narrow, then somewhere far away. Her shoulders drew up toward her ears. Her hands pressed flat against her thighs. She stood. Dad, she said. One word, one syllable. And in that syllable, Carver heard everything the file had told him, and everything it had left out. He heard the particular pitch of a voice calibrated to avoid provocation. He heard submission layered over terror, layered over something older and deeper. The exhaustion of a person who has been afraid for so long that fear has become indistinguishable from identity. There she is, Griffin said, and he moved toward her with his arms open. Nora did not step back. She did not flinch. She stood perfectly still, and allowed her father to embrace her, and the embrace looked normal, warm even, except that her arms did not rise. They stayed at her sides. Her hands remained flat against her legs. Her body was rigid inside the circle of his arms, like a mannequin being held by a living man. Carver watched. He watched the way Griffin's hand rested on the back of her neck, casually, proprietarily, the way one holds a dog's collar. He watched the way Nora's breathing went shallow and rapid, the moment that hand made contact. He watched the way her eyes over her father's shoulder found Carver's face, and held it, not with a request, not with a plea, but with the blank, dissociated stare of someone who had gone somewhere else inside herself. Griffin released her. He held her at arm's length, hands on her shoulders, and looked at her with an expression that mimicked tenderness, so precisely that anyone watching would have believed it. You look well, he said. Healthy. Are you eating? You look like you've put on weight. The comment landed like a blade between ribs. Subtle, precise, wrapped in concern. Nora's chin dropped half an inch. Her posture, already rigid, became smaller. I'm eating fine, she said. Good, good. Griffin turned to Carver with the smile again. She was always a picky eater. Drove me crazy. You know how girls are. Carver looked at Griffin Blake. He did not smile. He did not nod. He looked at him the way he looked at men who were about to discover the precise cost of underestimating him, with the absolute stillness of a predator who has already decided and is simply choosing the moment. Let's go inside, Carver said. We'll have lunch. Lunch was served in the dining room. Griffin sat at one end, Nora in the middle, Carver at the other end. The configuration was deliberate. Carver wanted to watch them both. Griffin talked. He talked about business, about the weather, about a fishing trip he was planning. He told stories about Nora as a child, charming, rehearsed anecdotes that painted a picture of a loving, if imperfect, single father, doing his best. He laughed at his own stories. He touched Nora's hand across the table when he referenced her, a gesture meant to look affectionate. Each time he touched her, her fork stopped moving. Each time he said her name, her shoulders rose a fraction of an inch. Each time he told a story about her childhood, something behind her eyes went dark, as though a light were being switched off, room by room inside a house she could not escape. Carver ate in silence. He spoke when spoken to. He gave nothing away. But his attention never wavered, and the architecture of his rage continued to build, floor by floor, corridor by corridor, until it was a structure so vast and so precise that it could have housed a city. After lunch, Griffin asked to speak with Nora alone. "Just 5 minutes," he said. "Father-daughter business. You understand." Carver looked at Nora. She was staring at the table. Her hands were in her lap. She had not looked up since the request was made. "Of course," Carver said. He stood. He buttoned his jacket. He walked to the door, and then he stopped. He did not turn around. He stood in the doorway, his back to the room, and he said the words with such quiet precision that they carried the weight of a verdict. "Owen will be outside the door. If you need anything, Nora, you only need to say so." The room went silent. Griffin's smile faltered. For one brief, unguarded moment, something crossed his face. Not fear exactly, but recognition. The recognition of a man who has just realized he's not in the room with someone he can manage. Carver left. He walked to his study. He sat behind his desk. He waited. 7 minutes later, the door to the dining room opened. Footsteps. Griffin's voice in the foyer, loud and jovial, saying goodbye to no one in particular. The front door. A car engine. Gravel. Silence. Carver walked to the dining room. Nora was standing by the window. Her back was to the door. Her arms were wrapped around herself. She was shaking, not crying, not speaking, just shaking as though her body were trying to expel something it had been holding for most of her life. He stood in the doorway. "Nora." She did not turn. "He won't visit again," Carver said. She turned now. Her face was streaked with tears she had not made a sound producing. Her eyes were red, raw, furious in a way he had not seen before. Not at him, not at anyone in the room, but at something vast and systemic and years deep, something that could not be fixed with a single sentence. "You don't know what he—" "I know," Carver said. 2 words, spoken without drama, without elaboration, without the need to prove or explain. "I know." Nora stared at him. Something in her face changed. The fury did not disappear, but it shared space with something else now. Surprise, confusion, and the very first tentative filament of relief. The kind of relief that comes not from being saved, but from being believed. "You know," she repeated, flat, testing. "I know what he did to you. I know how long it went on, and I am telling you with absolute certainty that he will not be permitted in this house again." She opened her mouth, closed it, her hands unclenched. The shaking slowed. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was barely audible. "Why would you care?" It was the most honest question anyone had asked Carver Ross in years. And for a moment, he did not have an answer. Not because he didn't care, but because the word care felt insufficient, imprecise, too small for the thing that had taken root in his chest since the night he had seen her scars. He looked at her for a long time. "Because what was done to you was not your fault," he said, "and it should have been stopped by someone with the power to stop it. That person was not there then. I am here now." Nora pressed her hand against her mouth. A sound escaped. Not a cry, not a word, but something between them. Something that lived in the space where language fails, and the body speaks instead. She sank into the nearest chair. Carver did not approach her. He did not touch her. He stood in the doorway of his own dining room, and gave her the only thing he had ever been truly terrible at giving anyone. Space, time, the right to fall apart without consequence. In the weeks that followed, Carver began to dismantle himself. Not visibly, not dramatically, not in any way his men would notice, or his enemies would exploit, but quietly, in the small spaces between commands. He began removing the mechanisms of dominance that had governed every relationship he had ever had. He stopped entering rooms where she was without making sound first. A knock, a footstep, the clearing of his throat. He learned that she flinched less when she knew he was coming. He learned that anticipation was different from fear, and that the distance between the two was a sound in a hallway. He stopped telling her where to sit, when to eat, what to do. He replaced commands with suggestions. Then he replaced suggestions with silence. Then he let silence become its own kind of invitation. The kind that said, "This is your space too, and you may use it however you choose." He noticed that she began to move differently. Not overnight. Not in leaps, in millimeters. The first time she poured her own coffee before he had poured his, she hesitated with the pot in her hand, glancing at him sideways, waiting for correction. He said nothing. She poured. The next morning, she poured again without looking. The first time she walked down the center of a hallway, instead of along the wall, she caught herself halfway through and corrected, pressing back toward the baseboard, as though pulled by a magnetic force. But the next day she made it 4 more steps toward the center, before the pull took her back. And the day after that, 5. He watched these small victories the way a man might watch a plant he had been told was dead begin to produce a single green leaf with stillness, with attention, with the understanding that growth at this scale required not intervention, but witness. One evening, 3 weeks after Griffin's visit, Nora appeared in the doorway of Carver's study. She was standing in a way he had not seen before, not pressed against the frame, not braced for dismissal, but simply standing, her weight evenly distributed, her hands at her sides. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He set down the contract he'd been reading. "Yes." She looked at the floor, then at the window, then back at him. "Why haven't you touched me?" The question sat in the room between them. It was not an invitation. It was a genuine inquiry, delivered with the confused sincerity of someone who had been taught that physical contact was a currency owed, and who could not understand why the debt had not been collected. Carver leaned back in his chair. He considered the question with the same gravity he gave to anything that mattered. "Because you have not asked me to," he said. "You are my husband. That is not the same thing as permission." Something broke open in her face. It was not dramatic. It was not cinematic. It was a small, private rearrangement of features. The brows softening, the jaw unclenching, the eyes filling with something that was not tears, but might have been their precursor. The look of someone who has just been told a rule they have lived under their entire life does not actually exist. "I don't understand you," she whispered. "I know," he said. And then, quietly, "That's all right." She stood in the doorway for another moment. Then she nodded once, and left. Carver returned to his contract, but the words swam. The clauses blurred. He sat for a long time, staring at nothing, and he felt the architecture of his life, the carefully constructed fortress of control and indifference, develop its first crack. Not from attack, from tenderness, which he was beginning to learn, was infinitely more destructive. A week later, Owen came to him with an update. Griffin had been making calls, reaching out to contacts within the organization, asking questions about his niece, about the arrangement, about whether the marriage was being honored. His language was careful, coded, but the implication was clear. He considered Nora a transaction, and he wanted to ensure his investment was performing. Carver listened to the report. His face did not change. "Does he have anyone's ear?" Carver asked. "No one who matters. He's reaching, but he's getting bolder." "How bold?" he asked. "If the marriage could be." Owen paused. "Renegotiated. If terms hadn't been met." Carver's jaw tightened. It was the only visible reaction. But Owen, who had seen that particular jaw clench precede events that reshaped entire organizations, understood its weight. "Shut it down," Carver said, quietly. "Make sure every door he tries to open closes before his hand reaches the knob. And if he contacts her directly, phone, text, letter, I want to know within the hour." Owen nodded and left. Carver sat in the silence of his study and thought about the mathematics of power. He had spent 40 years wielding it as a tool of accumulation, territory, influence, capital. He had never once considered that power could be wielded as shelter, that the same structures built to dominate could, with intention, be reconfigured to protect. It was a new equation, and he was still learning the variables. 2 months into the marriage, on an October evening, when the estate was bathed in copper light, Carver sat across from his wife, and did the hardest thing he had ever done. He let go. "Nora," she looked up from her book. The cookbook had been replaced by one of the novels he'd left on her nightstand. A slow, intricate story about a woman who walked across Spain alone. Yes, her voice had changed. He had noticed it changing over weeks, gaining half a register, losing the whispered thinness that had defined it. She still spoke carefully, but she no longer spoke as though each word were a debt. Carver set down the pen he had been holding. He folded his hands on the desk. He looked at her with the kind of deliberate attention he reserved for moments that could not be undone. "I want you to know something," he said, "and I want you to hear it without thinking I expect a response." She closed her book. She gave him her full attention. "This arrangement was made without your consent," he said. "You were given to me by a man who had no right to give you. You were traded like property, and I participated in that transaction. I may not have known the full extent of what you were escaping, but I knew you did not choose this, and I accepted it anyway." She did not move. Her hands tightened around the book in her lap. "I cannot undo that," he continued. "I cannot go back and make a different decision. But I can make one now." He paused. The study was quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the oaks that lined the estate drive. "You can leave." 3 words, spoken with the precision and finality of a man who understood that this sentence might cost him more than any deal he had ever made. "You can leave this house, this marriage, this arrangement. I will provide you with enough money to live independently, for as long as you need. I will ensure that you are protected, that Griffin cannot reach you, that no one associated with me or with him will ever be in a position to harm you. You will owe me nothing. There will be no debt, no obligation, no consequence." Nora stared at him. Her lips parted. Her eyes searched his face with an intensity he had never seen from her before. Not fear, not confusion, but something ferocious and fragile. The look of someone standing at the edge of something vast, and trying to determine if it was real. Her voice caught. She tried again. "You're letting me go. I am telling you that you are never mine to keep." The sentence landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. It rippled outward, displacing everything. Nora's hands released the book. It slid from her lap and landed on the rug with a soft sound. She pressed her palms against her face. Her shoulders began to shake. The sound that came from behind her hands was not a sob, not a cry, but something deeper. A sound that comes from the place where pain is stored for so long that its release is indistinguishable from breaking. Carver did not move. He sat in his chair and watched her come apart. And he did not go to her, did not comfort her, did not try to fix or contain what she was feeling. Because he understood with a clarity that had taken him 48 years and this woman to learn that some things must be felt completely before they can be released. Minutes passed. The light shifted. When Nora lifted her face from her hands, her eyes were red and wet and bright. Not with sadness, with something he could not immediately identify. "No one," she said quietly, "has ever told me I could leave." He nodded. "Not Griffin. Not the counselors who were supposed to check on me. Not the teachers who saw the bruises. Not the doctors who stitched the cuts. No one in my entire life has ever looked at me and said, 'You can go.'" She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She straightened in the chair. And then she did something that Carver, for all his experience in reading people, had not predicted. She laughed. It was small, wet, broken at the edges, but it was real. The laugh of someone who has just seen the absurdity of their own captivity from the outside for the first time. "I'm not leaving," she said. Carver's expression did not change. But something behind his eyes shifted. "I'm not leaving," she repeated, firmer now. "Not because I'm afraid. Not because I have nowhere to go. Not because I owe you anything." She paused. Her chin lifted. Her eyes held his directly, fully, without looking away. "I'm staying because this is the first place I've ever been where I'm not waiting for someone to hurt me." The room was very quiet. "I'm staying," she said, and her voice broke. She pressed her lips together, steadied herself, and finished. "Because you gave me the choice, and that is the first real thing anyone has ever given me." Carver sat behind the desk he had sat behind for 20 years, in the house he had built with the earnings of a life he had never questioned, and he felt something shift inside him that would never shift back. A wall he did not know he had. Because it had been there so long, it had become indistinguishable from the man himself, developed a crack so deep it reached the foundation. He did not speak. He did not need to. She picked up her book. She opened it. She continued reading. And the silence between them, which had once been heavy with all the things they did not know how to say, became something else entirely. It became the silence of two people who had chosen freely, deliberately, against all expectation, to be in the same room. It was the most intimate thing either of them had ever experienced. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, what does real love look like to you? Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is choose gentleness in a world that taught us cruelty.